when silence becomes louder than thunder, and eternity feels closer than breath. In such a moment, time is no longer a companion but a witness standing still at the edge of truth. A voice, not heard with ears but felt in the soul, begins to call what the world taught you to ignore, and in that trembling space between life and forever, something sacred begins to speak. It is here that every illusion fades, and only what is real remains standing before you. When the human mind, so often busy negotiating with tomorrow, is forced into a silence it never learned how to speak within. It is not the silence of rest, nor the silence of peace, but the silence of realization, where every excuse loses its shape and every delay becomes visible in its true weight. In that space, time no longer behaves like something owned or managed, but like something slipping beyond the reach of human hands, as if it were never truly ours to begin with. The heart begins to recognize, with a strange trembling clarity, that what was once called later was never promised, and what was treated as endless was always quietly finite. It is in this awakening that the illusion of control begins to collapse. The plans that were drawn so confidently, the intentions that were postponed with ease, the words left unspoken under the assumption of another chance, all begin to gather like witnesses in the courtroom of the soul. And there is no defense strong enough to argue against the simple truth that time does not pause for human hesitation. It moves with a quiet authority, not cruel but indifferent, not angry but absolute. The realization is not merely intellectual, it pierces deeper, as though the spirit itself is being asked to account for every moment it once believed it could reclaim later. In this awareness, even the smallest seconds begin to feel significant, almost heavy with meaning. The ticking of time is no longer background noise but a message that cannot be ignored. A breath becomes noticeable. Not because it is difficult, but because it is counted. A heartbeat feels less like biology and more like a reminder that something is steadily approaching its appointed edge. The mind, once comfortable in distraction, becomes sharply aware that nothing is as permanent as it pretended to be. And then comes the unsettling clarity that much of life was spent under the assumption of excess time. Days were traded for delays, opportunities were exchanged for comfort, and convictions were postponed in the belief that there would always be another moment to return to what truly mattered. Yet now, in this narrowing corridor of awareness, everything appears differently. The same life that once felt spacious now feels measured, almost delicately balanced on an unseen threshold where every remaining second carries the intensity of finality, and the soul begins to listen in a way it never did before, as though something beyond the veil is gently pressing upon the edges of understanding. That time was never a possession but a passing gift that was always moving, always slipping, always leading somewhere beyond what the eyes can hold. And in that realization the heart begins to open to a truth it had long postponed confronting. Beyond what the eyes can hold, and in that realization the heart begins to open to a truth it had long postponed confronting, and in that fragile opening of awareness, something deeper than memory begins to stir, as if the unseen world has not been distant at all, but listening all along, waiting for the noise of life to finally lower itself so a different kind of voice can be heard. And in that sacred stillness, where time feels thin and reality feels stripped of its usual weight, the soul becomes aware that it is not alone in its reflection, because love does not end where breath stops, and connection is not bound by the limits of flesh or distance, but continues in a form that human understanding can only sense, not fully describe. Is here that the unseen message begins to feel real, not as imagination, not as emotional projection, but as something deeply personal, as though it is being carried across a boundary that cannot be crossed by the living, yet can still be touched by the heart that remembers. The image of a mother, no longer held by time, rises not as a fading memory but as a living presence within the conscience, not to disturb but to awaken, not to accuse but to reveal what was once overlooked in the rush of life. And her love, which once expressed itself through ordinary moments, through patience, sacrifice, and silent endurance, now feels amplified beyond earthly limitation, as if every unspoken prayer she once carried has become part of a message that cannot be ignored in this final narrowing of awareness. In this inner encounter, the heart begins to feel a weight that is not sorrow alone, but a mixture of longing, recognition, and sudden understanding. The distance that once seemed normal between Inattention and gratitude now feels unbearable, as if every forgotten moment of appreciation has gathered into a single point of emotional clarity. The soul begins to perceive that love was never absent. It was simply overlooked in the busyness of becoming something else, chasing something else, reaching for things that could never truly replace the warmth that was always already given. And now, in this final stretch of awareness, that warmth returns not as comfort alone, but as a message that presses gently yet firmly against the conscience, reminding it that what was once taken for granted was, in truth, the most sacred presence it ever knew. And within that realization, the unseen voice of maternal love feels as if it is reaching through layers of existence, not with words formed in sound, but with meaning formed in essence, carrying a final tenderness that cannot be measured by time or distance. And in that tenderness, the soul begins to understand something it had avoided understanding. All along. And in that understanding, where tenderness becomes heavier than explanation and memory turns into a living presence, the noise of the world begins to dissolve further, as though reality itself is being peeled back layer by layer until only what is essential remains. In this stripped-down clarity, the soul finds itself standing before its own neglected awareness, where thoughts can no longer hide behind distraction or delay. It is not a place of judgment imposed from outside, but a confrontation rising from within, where conscience begins to speak in a tone that is both familiar and unsettling, because it carries the echo of everything once felt but never fully obeyed. The awakening of conscience begins quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a distant bell that grows clearer the longer it is ignored. It does not shout, yet it cannot be silenced, because it is formed from every moment the heart chose convenience over conviction, silence over truth, and postponement over presence. In this space, even the smallest moral hesitation returns with surprising clarity, not as accusation but as remembrance. The soul begins to recognize that it was never unaware, it was simply willing to overlook what it already knew. And that recognition carries a weight that is deeper than regret, because it reveals not just actions, but patterns of avoidance that shaped an entire way of living. In this state, the mind begins to see how easily it adapted to noise, how quickly it learned to normalize distraction, and how comfortably it accepted distance from what truly mattered. The conscience, however, remains untouched by such adaptation. It retains the purity of truth, refusing to bend with time or circumstance. And now, in this final narrowing of perception, it rises with quiet authority, not to destroy but to reveal, not to condemn but to illuminate. Every ignored responsibility, every dismissed impulse toward goodness, every moment where compassion was delayed begins to surface with a clarity that feels almost eternal. And as this inner light grows stronger, the soul starts to realize that awareness itself is a form of accountability, because once something is truly seen, it cannot be unseen again. The comfort of ignorance no longer protects, and the shield of distraction no longer holds. What remains is a direct encounter between the self and the truth it once walked past without stopping. In this encounter, there is no escape into noise, no retreat into denial, only the steady unfolding of understanding that every choice carried meaning beyond its moment, and every moment was quietly shaping something far greater than what was ever considered at the time. And as that understanding deepens, the soul begins to feel the full force of its own neglected weight, not as something external pressing upon it, but as something it has carried unknowingly all along. The illusion that life was made of isolated, forgettable moments begins to dissolve, revealing instead a continuous thread of consequences woven through every choice, every delay, every ignored call toward what was right. In this unfolding awareness, the conscience no longer speaks only as a reminder, but as a mirror that reflects the life that was lived when no one was watching, when decisions were made in quiet privacy under the assumption that they carried no eternal echo. In that mirror, the revelation of choices emerges with unsettling clarity. What once appeared small now reveals itself as significant, not because of outward scale, but because of inner alignment. Every moment where kindness was withheld, where truth was softened into silence, where responsibility was postponed into an imagined future, begins to surface not as separate incidents but as a pattern that shaped the direction of the soul itself. And in this recognition, the heart begins to understand that nothing was ever truly insignificant, because even the smallest act carried the imprint of intention. And intention carries a weight that time does not erase. The mind, once skilled at justifying delay, now finds those justifications dissolving under the pressure of final clarity. The belief that there would always be another chance begins to feel fragile, almost self-deceptive, as if it were a story told to avoid the urgency of truth. And now, in this compressed horizon of awareness, every unchosen good becomes more visible than the chosen distractions that replaced it. The soul begins to see that it was not time that failed it, but attention that drifted away from what mattered most in the moments when it still had the freedom to respond differently. And in this realization, there is a strange mixture of sorrow and lucidity, as if the heart is finally reading its own history without the comforting blur of forgetting. The weight of every postponed apology, every neglected responsibility, every moment of moral hesitation that was allowed to pass without correction, gathers into a single awareness that feels too vast to ignore. It is not merely regret for what was done, but a deeper recognition of what was continually not done, and how absence itself became a form of presence in the shaping of a life that now stands fully exposed to its own truth. And in that exposure, where absence itself begins to speak louder than action, the heart is drawn into a deeper confrontation with what it once chose to overlook in the name of urgency, ambition, or comfort. The weight of what was not done becomes almost heavier than what was done, because a mission carries its own silent architecture, building a reality that only becomes visible when there is no longer time left to rebuild it. In this compressed awareness, the soul begins to understand that life was never only measured by grand decisions, but by the quiet, repeated neglect of what conscience had been gently urging all along. The weight of love that was ignored begins to surface with a force that is not emotional alone, existential, as if the very foundation of meaning is being questioned. The heart sees with painful clarity how often love was present in forms too simple to recognize at the time, patient words that were dismissed, silent sacrifices that went unnoticed, and constant care that was assumed rather than received with gratitude. And in this realization, love no longer appears as something guaranteed or infinite in its availability, but as something deeply intentional, something that was continuously offered even when it was not acknowledged, something that asked for nothing yet deserved everything in return. Now, in this narrowing edge of awareness, the soul begins to feel the absence of response as a kind of moral echo. Every ignored moment of affection returns not as accusation, but as truth finally allowed to be seen without distortion. The mind, once capable of rationalizing distance and delay, now finds itself unable to soften what it is witnessing. There is no longer the comfort of reinterpretation, because everything is being understood in its original purity, without the filters that once made neglect feel acceptable or reversible. And in this purity, the realization grows that love, when unrecognized, does not disappear. It simply accumulates in silence, waiting for a moment when it can no longer be ignored. That moment now feels present, not as punishment, but as revelation, where the heart is asked to finally acknowledge the depth of what was always there, but never fully received. And within that acknowledgement, something irreversible begins to form in the soul, a clarity that cannot be undone, as if every unreturned gesture of love has finally found its place in the full accounting of a life that is now seeing itself without illusion, and in that accounting, where nothing is softened and nothing is hidden, the soul is drawn into a confrontation that feels less like external judgment and more like the unveiling of its own inner truth. There is no escape into, denial anymore, because denial itself begins to feel like a fading language that can no longer translate what is being revealed. Every moment that was once brushed aside now stands with quiet persistence, not demanding punishment, but demanding recognition. And recognition in this state carries a weight far more profound than fear, because it cannot be reversed once it has fully formed within awareness. The confrontation between regret and mercy begins to unfold like two forces meeting in the same confined space of the heart. Regret speaks first, not in anger, but in the sorrow of realization, showing everything that was delayed, avoided, or misunderstood. It does not exaggerate, it simply reveals. Mercy, however, does not arrive as an argument against regret, but as a deeper possibility that exists beyond the finality of self-condemnation. It does not erase what has been seen, but it reframes the meaning of seeing itself, as though understanding carries within it the first hint of release. In this tension, the soul finds itself suspended between what it has become aware of and what it might still be allowed to become within that awareness. Regret insists on permanence, on the irreversibility of time, on the weight of consequences that cannot be undone. Mercy, however, whispers through the same silence, suggesting that truth, once fully faced, is not only an end, but also a beginning of something more honest than denial ever allowed. And in this inner dialogue, neither force cancels the other. Instead, they deepen the intensity of the moment, making it impossible for the heart to remain indifferent or untouched. The final seconds of awareness begin to feel less like an ending and more like a narrowing passage where everything essential is being brought into focus at once. There is no room left for distraction, no space for postponement, only the raw encounter between what was lived and what is now fully understood. And in that encounter, the soul is held in a stillness so complete that even thought begins to lose its urgency, as if existence itself has slowed down just enough to ensure that nothing important is missed in the final unfolding of realization. And in that slowing of existence, where even thought begins to dissolve into pure awareness, the soul stands at the edge of something it can no longer interpret through the language of ordinary living. Everything that once defined identity, ambition, memory, regret, hope begins to lose its separateness, gathering instead into a single unified clarity that feels both intimate and overwhelming. It is as if life itself has condensed into one final question that does not seek words, but truth, and in that stillness, the soul becomes aware that it is being asked not what it achieved, but what it became in the presence of love, truth, and time. The eternal question rises not as sound, but as presence. It is not imposed, yet it cannot be ignored. It does not accuse, yet it cannot be softened. It simply exists, as if it was always there beneath every moment of life, quietly waiting for this exact instant when everything else would fall away. And in facing it, the soul begins to understand that existence was never random, never disconnected, but deeply woven into a moral and spiritual continuity that stretches beyond the boundaries of physical experience. Nothing was ever truly lost. It was only stored within the unseen fabric of what the soul was becoming. In this final unveiling, the idea of self begins to feel less like ownership and more like responsibility. Every thought, every choice, every silence becomes part of a greater reflection that cannot be separated from identity. And in this reflection, the soul sees not only what it did, but how it responded to what it knew deep within. The truth becomes undeniable that awareness was always present, even in moments of avoidance, and that life was a continuous invitation to align with that awareness, rather than drift away from it. And now, as all distinctions fade, there remains only a profound stillness where understanding and existence are no longer separate experiences. The final realization does not arrive as conclusion, but as unveiling, where the soul recognizes that everything it was searching for had always been pointing back to this moment of clarity, where nothing remains hidden, nothing remains delayed, and nothing remains outside the reach of truth, as it stands fully revealed within the silence of eternity.